there are many things I'd love to get to, but I really should ask you at least about the whole metaphor of the slave woman and the free woman, because I think this is one that is very confusing for people, um, no matter which interpretive lens they're using to look
Yes.
at. And today you've used Catholicism quite frequently as a metaphor for Judaism of the first century. Now, I understand what you're saying, and I think people in the audience will understand. But if in 2,000 years someone listened to this, they might be confused.
Right.
What is he talking about? Is he
Yeah.
equating Catholicism with Judaism?
Good
And I
point.
think your argument here about the analogy, and I think it's chapter 4 of Galatians, um, is somewhat similar to that. So maybe you can just explain how you understand that whole thing about the slave woman and the free woman
Yeah.
and circumcision and so forth.
Yeah, it's a good point. Now you're getting a 2-for-1 on this then, because my allegory work, I still have not done much of this similar kind of podcast and so on, discussing. And in fact, I've done a number of papers, and I'm only now working up a published version for my forthcoming Reading Galatians Within Judaism volume in that series of collected essays. And I probably should do a book on it, but this is research that I actually, for the most part, did in 2003 and 4. So I really, it's dated. While I keep updating it to new things I discover, I really need to get it out there. So I'm glad for the opportunity. The usual way of reading the allegory is that Paul is saying that Jewish people are children of Hagar, and Christian people are the sons of the children of Sarah. And to me, well, first of all, that just makes no sense, because nothing in the letter is about that distinction. The letter is about the distinction for non-Jews who are already Christ followers. It's not a question of Torah or Christ, as it's usually, it's not a law-free gospel. It's a proselyte conversion-free, if you will, gospel. So if we just approach it and ask, what does he argue and how does he argue it? He starts with, he actually functions in a way, and I'm comfortable saying this, even though I know it can't be proven yet. There are plenty of historical bits and pieces that point this direction, both from Philo, from the New Testament text, and from how you date the Targumim, that what Paul is doing here is very similar to a later synagogue sermon, as you know, from the liturgical Haftarah tradition, which is a tradition in which you take your reading cycle through the Torah, and you link that with passages from the prophets or the writings in order to create a homily, in order to do your lesson for the day. And the lesson may or may not have much to do with those two texts, because you're forced into these two texts that someone has decided are related to each other. And sometimes it's very obvious how they are, and sometimes it's less obvious how they are. These traditions were in development during Paul's time. My argument actually has led me, just dealing with Paul's text, to see what Paul's doing as probably evidence of an early Haftarah connection between the text related to Abraham having two wives, or two women and two sons in Genesis, and especially the text in that comes up as Paul moves through that in 16 and 21, about the conflict that this creates between the son of the slave woman Ishmael and the slave and the son of the free woman Sarah, Isaac, who's born miraculously when she's 100 years old, and Abraham's 100 years old, and they cannot have children except by miracle, by spirit. And Paul employs this method, I think, of starting with the Torah text. He only quotes a couple of things later on, but he basically summarizes it as if the reading had taken place. And now I can deal with the summary. And he links these to Isaiah 54:1, which did play with the theme, but it may or may not be exactly based on that, but could be on Hannah, for example, or any other of the 7 women in Scripture who were infertile, but they end up being the one who has the favored child. So that is a trope in the Hebrew Scripture that Paul is playing with, that things are other than they seem. At the moment, the innovation, the nomos, the custom, that when a woman cannot bear a child, she can use her handmaid or a surrogate to have the child for her husband and therefore for herself. That's a nomos, a nomos. And it's in the nomos that it happened. Did that work out very well? Not really. It was adverse to faithfulness. Abraham should have trusted God for Sarah to have the child. And in the Genesis story, God reiterates this. No, that's not the child that will be the heir. That child will come through Sarah, and it eventually does as a miracle. But what that creates is a conflict. And Paul cites that passage to say that Ishmael is real. It's not translated this way. It's usually translated as persecute, but the word really isn't best translated persecute. It's more like contested. The older child normally inherits, so he contests the younger child, Isaac's, right to be the heir article. And Paul uses this to describe the situation that they can identify themselves with. Because he says, he appeals to them, you have the experience of the Spirit, right? Yes. So you're like Isaac. You're not through Isaac. You're not genealogical descendants of Abraham through Isaac. But Abraham was promised that through his seed would be a blessing to all the peoples, non-genealogical descendants of Abraham. And you have the Spirit experience. You are those people like Isaac. The people that you have an experience also of suffering, which goes back to your earlier question. He now uses suffering as a proof. The fact that you're suffering, not just in general, but a contested identity as heirs, if you don't also become proselytes, is evidence that you're like Isaac, who was contested identity as the heir, because he wasn't the firstborn. So the issue is not between Jew and Christian, if you will, to be anachronistic. It's a difference between 2 non-Jews. Which model guarantees you the inheritance? Trust in the faithfulness of God to complete what was promised, that all the nations would be blessed in his Abraham's seed, or trust in a custom that has been like the Hagar thing that is expedient for solving a current social problem that creates its own problem. And so Paul is using it to undermine proselyte conversion and basically saying it's not in Scripture, but it's a model for slaves. So if you've already experienced the Spirit, why would you now, and your freeborn children, so to speak, why would you now want to choose the model for the slave? And so at the end in 5:1, normally people say, it says, so, for freedom, you've been freed. So don't be enslaved again, right, to a yoke of slavery. Don't be bound again to a yoke of slavery. You're yoked again to slavery. Well, again here can't mean Torah, because they were never bound to Torah as non-Jews. But it can mean proselyte conversion as the way to solve your problem and become heirs. They were yoked to that before because that was the prevailing custom, nomos. And they're being yoked to it now by the pressure that's put on them to either understand themselves as merely guests, however welcome they may be, who practice a Jewish way of life, but they're not Jews, or become Jews and get the full goods, the inheritance. They're being contested. So that's what the freedom is they have to hold on to. The freedom of the gospel truth is that you have become heirs. So it flips this whole thing on its head, and it puts it not only in a Jewish context of Haftarah, but where would they be able to understand this if they're not going to synagogue groups where they're hearing the text of Torah as authoritative, and therefore Paul employs them authoritatively to make his countercultural point.
It's really, really interesting. And to be honest, I think I have to think about this more. I mean, it does flip everything on its head. It's fascinating to hear this explanation.
What Bible do you read? And how do you know it's the right one?
There's only one version of the Bible, right?
It might surprise you to learn that Bible translations led to many versions of Holy Scripture. Long ago, translators interpreted the Hebrew Bible, ensuring it would be enjoyed in many languages. But when they encountered Hebrew words they didn't understand, translators relied on their individual cultural context and used different words with different meanings unrelated to the original ones. This led to Bible versions that lacked the full, beautiful, original explanations becoming part of our history. That's why when you join our online classes, you'll get back to the source of the original Hebrew Bible to uncover hidden meanings.
Get back to the source. Join our online course today, where the treasures of the authentic Bible await you.
Click on the link and register to start your biblical experience.